Welcome to the podcast of ReMO, the Researcher Mental Health Observatory. In the previous season of this podcast, we have heard the stories of 3 brave researchers who came forward to share their struggles on their journey through academia. In this season, we meet 3 guests who bring a different perspective. They talk about the reality of academia today, both at personal and systemic level, commenting on what works and what doesn't, and most importantly, on how to move forward. In other words, they contribute to a transformation of the research ecosystem to benefit well-being and mental health of the professionals, the people who work in it. Quote, "We refuse to see things for what they are and ask why. We want to envision things that never were and ask, why not?" I am Federica Bressan, and I welcome you on this podcast. Welcome, everybody. Today, we've been speaking to Luca Viganò, Professor of Cybersecurity at King's College London. In the first part of this conversation, Luca talked about the importance of the mentor or supervisor in a PhD program and outlined what his or her job is, what duties he or she has, in order to be a successful mentor, which will reflect on the students, making them successful in turn. Luca has also mentioned that a feeling of being abandoned by the supervisor and a lack of communication are common complaints that he used to receive when serving as director of a PhD school or college years ago. Luca, what are some of the strategies that you put in place when you were faced with those complaints and that seemed to work to help the healing of the mentor-student relationship?
So I don't think there is a silver bullet, because otherwise we would all employ it. But one strategy which I found really works is to actually sit down both with the student and supervisor and discuss their expectations on the kind of supervision provided. As I mentioned in our initial discussion, the supervisor is at the same time employing the student, but also working for the student. And one thing that I noticed is that the most successful supervisors, and therefore the happiest PhD students, are the ones who are able to adapt their supervision style to the student. I've seen students, including some of my own, who were incredibly happy to be, let's say, left alone for most of the time, and then have regular meetings with the supervisor, which would be very research-intensive meetings in which they would discuss the fine details of the work that the student had done in the meantime, maybe very destructive from the point of view of the supervisor, who would pick it apart, and then they would put it together, back together again. I've seen other students who need their hands to be held in a much closer way. And while I appreciate that ultimately the student is an apprentice of the supervisor, of the mentor, and learns from them how to do research, I think it is also important that the supervisor understands that the same approach will not necessarily work for every student, because students are different, because their problems are different, because their character, their behavior, the temperament is very different, and therefore there is some middle ground where they should try to meet. And being able to mediate between student and supervisor and help them identify what is the best middle ground has really led to solutions of many of the crises. In many other cases, I was very happy not to have to do anything as coordinator, because the student and the supervisor had already found their rhythm, had already found their language. In many cases, it's also really a matter of finding the appropriate language for communicating. And they had found a very good working relationship, which led to a very successful PhD. I've seen, in particular with international students, so students coming from another country, possibly a different culture, a challenge in finding the right way to communicate with their supervisor, being too obsequious. So, saying sir or madam or professor or something like that all the time, which in many cases creates a barrier of communication because there is too much of a commandeering relationship between the supervisor and the student. I've seen students finding language that the supervisor was not comfortable, or using a language that the supervisor was not comfortable with, because the supervisor was expecting a little bit more of, I'm tempted to say the word respect, but it's not the right word, but a more, let's say, a more respectful language that, not such a colloquial language. Again, that will depend on the student and the supervisor, but in many cases, what I've seen is that this is a discussion that they have not had. Because it's not an easy discussion to have. What do you expect of me? How would you like me to speak out my mind? How would you like me to address you? And therefore, as a successful coordinator, you should jump in and help them find such a good communication language. This doesn't necessarily need to be the coordinator. It could be the second supervisor. It could be the supervising team, the supervising panel that we mentioned in the first part of our discussion that helps student and supervisor communicate in the best way.
In the first part of this conversation, you have mentioned that sometimes this relationship, the communication between these two people, the mentor and the student, cannot be solved, really. And the best thing that can happen is that the student finds another supervisor so that these two part ways and proceed on successful paths. What if several students complain about the same supervisor? In that case, it may really mean that that person lacks some minimum skills to provide good mentorship. So most likely, almost every student is going to complain about the same things about that person. Can you really dispense someone from having PhD students? Or can you talk to them and change their style, provided that supervisors are normally senior researchers in a stage in their careers where it may not be that easy to accept advice on certain things. There may need to be a certain amount of humility there on their part. And do you believe that the skills necessary to provide good mentorship can be acquired and learned at all? So would you be in favor, for example, of training programs for mentors?
Training always helps. However, one should be careful not to overdo it too much. So if you have an academic who has reached the point of their career where they are supervising independently PhD students, in many cases, they will not be particularly happy to spend hours and hours in training. On the other hand, the occasional refresher course, a morning spent reflecting on what are the qualities of a good supervision, what are the typical challenges, what are the pitfalls, what are the solutions that other people have found and adopted, that is very, very helpful. And for instance, at King's College London, but I'm aware it's the same in many other institutions worldwide, there are such courses offered. And actually, in my institution, like in many others, you're not allowed to be a supervisor if you don't take a refresher course every 3 years or something like that. And I think that asking somebody to spend a morning reflecting on PhD supervision once every 3 years is not such a big ask. It helps, even if it is perceived as patronizing by some colleagues. On the other hand, there are cases in which the supervisor is struggling, not just with one student, but with many students. And if that is the case, then training might not be enough because there might be some more fundamental issues. What I've seen works in many cases is to have a conversation with the supervisor, maybe involve other parts of the university, in many cases, there will be the need to involve also the head of department or the head of the faculty, the dean, or whatever the internal structure of the university is, to have a conversation that should not be punitive. It shouldn't be, we're not going to give you PhD scholarships anymore, therefore you're not going to be allowed to supervise PhD students anymore, but rather be constructive and say, okay, there is quite likely an issue, and how can we help you become a better supervisor again? And I would stress the point again, because hopefully that person was successful initially and then things had changed in the meantime, or maybe that person was actually never really successful, and then it's even more important to have that kind of conversation. What helps, for instance, is to give them the opportunity to work in pairs, to be put in a team with colleagues who help both the student and the supervisor, without giving the supervisor the feeling that they're being watched, that they're being judged, that they're being observed. They're being supported, which is very, very different. It's a difficult thing to put in place, but that will, in many cases, really help the supervisor and therefore the students.
I like that you say that training may help, because what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that training is not the solution, or even better, that not everything that makes a good supervisor can be taught or learned in a training program. The relationship between mentor and mentee is a human relationship, besides, of course, and very importantly, a professional relationship. And there may be human qualities that you either have or you don't, or qualities that are a better match with this student and not that one, just like any other human relationship. Which makes me think of this aspect we have not covered yet. PhD students have been around for decades, and so have supervisors. Academia is changing, but it's always been changing. So for one, we could raise the issue that a supervisor approaching retirement today entered academia when academia was a very different place, and this may cause he or she to have different expectations, understandably so. I mean, age and nationality, for that matter, and scientific domain are all dimensions of a human being and a scientist that are surely going to influence the way they act as supervisors. But we could raise this issue that I want to ask you about, which is we talk about PhD students complaining about their supervisors today, in today's scenario. But in fact, these problems must have always been around. From the way we speak today, not just you and I in general, it seems like academia is facing a crisis. Academia is falling apart. People complain, we need to introduce mandatory training. But these problems have always been around. What do you think? Have PhD students always complained about their supervisors?
I think these problems have always been there. It is true that academia is changing, like everything else around us, and not just because of the pandemic or economic crisis, but simply because things change naturally. The job market is changing. The kinds of job that we do is changing. The academia is changing. The way we teach is changing. The way we do research is changing. So I wouldn't single out change as the reason for the problems. I think some fundamental problems have always been there, and now they're changing into other problems, but they're still problems. What is interesting, in my view, is to consider the fact that depending on which country we're looking at, PhD is a fairly recent institution. So I'm old enough to have witnessed colleagues in computer science in Italy who became professors without having a PhD because there was no PhD program in Italy at that point. And I've seen some of them be wonderful supervisors, even though they never had the supervising experience themselves, so being supervised themselves. I've seen some of them struggle, like I'm seeing colleagues like myself who actually did a PhD with a wonderful supervisor. So I'm eternally grateful to my supervisor, who is still 25 or almost 25 years after one of my closest friends in the academic world. I've seen my generation actually be, in Italy at least, one of the first to supervise students after having been supervised. I think the problems have always been there. And it is the standard problem between master and pupil, in a sense. And it is the standard problem that occurs when you actually consider the pressure on academia, which is not just the external pressure, from the government and from industry to deliver graduates who have certain skills, but it is also the pressure to actually be an all-rounder. As an academic, you need to be a good researcher, but you need also to be able to do research that brings in funding in many cases, whereas you might be very good at theoretical research, which is often much more difficult to get funding for. But you also need to be a good teacher in the classroom. You need to be a good teacher with undergraduate students who are just out of high school. You need to be a good teacher with master students who have experience, and you need to be a good supervisor. Actually, if you think about it, to find somebody who has all these qualities is quite difficult. I wouldn't say of myself that I tick all the boxes, and I don't know too many people that tick all the boxes very, very successfully. People have their different strengths, people have their different qualities. However, PhD supervision is an interesting point because it is really part of the overlap between education and research. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier on, you start as a PhD student and you finish as a doctor who is an early career researcher. And that transition, the transition from student to researcher, is where the supervisor needs to provide support. And it is difficult. And it is okay that it is difficult. I think that in many cases, we need to be honest with ourselves and with our colleagues and talk about these challenges because it is very natural to have them. But fortunately, there are also a number of solutions out there that we can adopt, that we can use to support both supervisor and student.
Speaking of support, and speaking of being all-rounders as scientists and teachers, I wonder what you think of the fact that supervisors are expected more and more to be able to receive and to respond to cries for help that are not about the science per se and not about the profession intended as networking or how to behave in academia, etc. They are personal cries for help, emotional, and I would like to say moral. For example, a student may go to his or her supervisor and say, I've been having a really hard time with the workload at the lab. The results are not good, and I have a deadline in a week. I've not been sleeping in the past few days, and I spent the weekend writing at my desk. I'm not well. This is very real because the PhD is a tough journey. It will take a lot from you. Do you think that it is okay to go to your supervisor with this kinds of personal, emotional complaints or cries for help, confessions sometimes? Because normally there's shame for not being able to just do it all effortlessly. And do you think that it is okay to expect the supervisors to know what to do in those cases?
Let me answer in a very personal way. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not able to provide sound help in such cases. Like, I'm not somebody working in administration, so I'm not able to navigate through all the different options that are there when there are financial problems or similar things. So I don't think it is fair to expect supervisors to be able to provide that kind of support because it's not something that they have learned in the vast majority of cases. And actually, I'm afraid that especially if there is a emotional, psychological crisis situation, the words of the supervisor might actually be counterproductive. On the other hand, as a supervisor, I'm always grateful when my students reach out to me with such issues. First of all, because it is good for me to be informed. It's good to know that they feel comfortable enough to talk to me about that. And I can help them talk to people who can really help them. So in many cases, universities have teams, internal teams, who can provide support in such moments of crisis. And it is good for the supervisor to be able to create a bridge between the student and such teams, because the student might not be aware that they exist or might feel uncomfortable in reaching out to them directly. So while I don't think I will ever be able to provide psychological counseling, and I would not even want to start trying because I wouldn't know what to say and what to do, I'm always happy to listen. I'm always happy to try and understand how perhaps changing our research supervision can support the student come out of the crisis. In some cases, it is good to have a small interruption. In some other cases, it's actually better to meet even more often to really provide more closer support for the student. And then I can really try and support them by putting in touch with professionals who can help with these issues.
Thank you, Luca, for sharing your point of view on this. It seems very, very sensible what you say. You say, I don't feel equipped to provide support on those matters, but I can help the student find someone who can. And at the same time, I'm happy if they come to me with those matters, and I'm happy to be informed because I'm the supervisor and I should be informed. That's great. Closing up, I would like to ask you if there is something else you would like to add, if there is something that I haven't asked you about, or if you want to give a take-home message for our audience who is not just made of PhD students, but supervisors too. You can talk to them too, or other professionals in the field of science.
I think that there are a lot of good things that can happen and that support both supervisor and students. There are training opportunities, there are reflection opportunities, there are these meetings with the supervision panel. There are regular opportunities for both students and supervisor to reflect and learn how to do their job better, both as a supervisor and as a student. But to me, the main point, what really changes the relationship between supervisor and student, is to understand that you're embarking in an adventure together, that you're going to be journey mates for 3, 4, 5 years, sitting side by side, rowing the same boat. And ideally, you should not rock the boat, but really steer it in the ultimate direction that you have chosen. It is a difficult journey, but it is one that can be extremely rewarding, extremely satisfying. And as I mentioned, in many cases, it creates collaborations, partnerships, friendships that go way beyond the 3 or 4 years or 5 years of the PhD.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more episodes, please check out our website at remo-network.eu. ReMO is spelled REMO-network.eu. The podcast was brought to you by the Researcher Mental Health Observatory, Cost Action number 19117. I am Federica Bressan, host and producer of this podcast. Additional audio editing by Davide Linzi.